Good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Shute. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Sussex, and I'm delighted to welcome you all this evening to the 10th annual Draper Lecture. 10 years of the Draper Lecture. It seems amazing to me. It seems like only yesterday that we began. And this lecture is in memory of Professor Colonel Gerald Draper, OBE, a former Nuremberg prosecutor and a major contributor to early legal studies at the University of Sussex, one of the first professors in law at the university. And his legacy continues today through the teaching of international and humanitarian law at the university. As well as remembering his legacy with this annual lecture, we award a number of Draper Scholarships each year, which give much-needed financial support to exceptional postgraduates who wish to study law with us. These scholarships are kindly funded by donations from alumni and friends at the University of Sussex. And I'd like to take this public opportunity to thank each and every one of you that has given. And I know that a number of you are here this evening. I would also like to welcome the current recipients of the Draper Scholarships attending here tonight. And we have Katie Pimenta, who is studying international human rights law, and Lewis Cockle, who is studying the graduate diploma in law, as well as one of our previous Draper scholars, Emma Fitzpatrick, who graduated with a postgraduate diploma in law in 2007. And I wonder if the three of you would mind standing up and identifying yourselves, and perhaps we could give you a round of applause. Our warm and great thanks go to Eden Ravenscroft for once again kindly supporting this event, and they've done so since we began, and we're very grateful indeed. 2018-19 is a very special year. It marks the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela and the 25th anniversary of Mandela becoming President of South Africa. At Sussex, we want to celebrate these anniversaries by ensuring that the Mandela Scholarship continues to provide students from South Africa and beyond with the opportunity to study at Sussex. The Mandela Scholarship has not only changed the lives of individual scholars, but it's contributed to the nation-building required in post-apartheid South Africa. The stories that Mandela scholars have shared with us stand as a testament to that. Established in 1973 by the University of Sussex Students' Union, Sussex was the first university in the UK to offer a Mandela Scholarship. And we made it possible for South Africans oppressed by apartheid to study at our university. Since then, more than 70 Mandela scholars have graduated from the university and have returned home to become leaders in their field, scientists, environmentalists, development professionals, and government ministers. Like Mandela and Sussex, they too aim to build a better world. Tonight, we are delighted to have our current Mandela scholars here with us. And I hope I got the pronunciation right. Nsiki Abayi, who is studying international education and development, and Simba Moyo, who is studying human rights law. And I wonder if they too could stand and identify themselves. Naturally, we require additional funding if we're going to continue to offer Mandela Scholarships to attract and train the next generation of students from countries in the Southern African development community, so that they can return home too to use their knowledge and skills constructively for social good and the development of their countries. You will find further information about supporting the Mandela Scholarships in the brochure on your seats, and we hope that you will support this cause. It is now my great honour to introduce our speaker this evening, Paul van Zyl. Paul grew up in South Africa. An anti-apartheid activist, he trained as a human rights lawyer, gaining a BA and an LLB from the University of Witwatersrand. He served as Executive Secretary of South Africa's Post-Apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 1995 to 1998. Working alongside Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, Paul was central to the process that sought to address the painful past of participants on all sides of apartheid. In 2001, Paul went on to co-found the International Centre for Transnational Justice, which works for justice in countries which have endured human rights abuses under repression and in conflict. The Centre works with victims, civil society groups, and national and international organisations to redress for victims and help prevent the sorts of atrocities that happened in the past happening again. Paul is also co-founder and CEO of a luxury fashion brand that partners with global artisans to incorporate handcrafted details. And he recently co-founded the Conduit Club in London, a members club with a difference, a special place that seeks to connect thinkers, leaders and innovators in social change, business and the arts in order to force impact for the greater social good. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Mr. Paul van Zyl.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. When I find myself in these extraordinarily august surroundings, I always like to think of other places where I've given talks. And a couple of years ago, I was invited by Sir Richard Branson to go and give a talk on Necker Island. And there was a very quick yes when I got that invitation. And when I arrived, I discovered to my horror that immediately prior to me, Bryan Stevenson was going to be talking. Bryan Stevenson is perhaps the most important human rights lawyer in the United States, by far the most inspirational speaker you will hear, a modern-day Nelson Mandela, and a man who has literally tens of millions of people who have watched his TED Talk. And I was told that I would be speaking immediately after him. And then I was told, so then I said, well, that's going to be tough. Who at least speaks after me? And Richard Branson said, Ben and Jerry, as in Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And so I was wedged between the most inspirational speaker in the world and people who were about to give you ice cream. And so that was an extraordinarily hard act to follow. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to try and do tonight. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I was very privileged to be born into a family where my parents told me, when many white South African parents told their children exactly the opposite, that apartheid was evil and wrong and needed to be contested, fought against, and overthrown. And so it was always clear that I was going to be a lawyer. And I arrived in university in 1987 at a time in which the state of emergency was raging in our country. The black student movement at my university was abducted and detained. Key figures were abducted and disappeared and never returned. Professors were assassinated. And we really were in the darkest hours of apartheid. And then in 1990, something miraculous happened, and Nelson Mandela was released, and it became clear that we would need to establish a process not just to sediment democracy in our country, but also to deal with the terrible crimes that had occurred under apartheid. So helped to draft the law establishing the Truth Commission, was employee number one of the commission, and served 3 very intense years as our nation grappled with a legacy of massive atrocity. And then when I co-founded the International Center for Transitional Justice, I then went on and worked in 30 countries around the world doing similar work. The first post-Fujimori government in Peru, the first Hassan II government in Morocco, the first post-Milosevic government in Yugoslavia, the first post-Suharto government in Indonesia, in East Timor, in Liberia, in Ghana, in Colombia, as nations grappled with and reckoned with a legacy of human rights abuse. And my starting point, and I think those of us who grew up in the human rights movement, our starting point when faced with repressive rule and mass atrocity was two things. One, the past had to be reckoned with. If you didn't proactively reckon with the past, it would return to haunt you. And it would return to haunt you in terms that were always and invariably less propitious and more adversarial than if you developed a set of proactive policies to confront the past. And then secondly, in the process of confronting the past, you wanted to establish democratic systems and constitutional systems which entrenched the rule of law, bills of rights, the separation of power. And I think in some ways, those of us who grew up in the human rights movement in the 1980s and then worked for almost 2 decades in the space, our template was working to establish democracy and constitutionalism while not sweeping the past under the carpet and seeking to reckon with a legacy of gross violations of human rights. And so what I want to try and do today is present an argument which is sort of a rejoinder to my own past, which is to say that I think that approach to dealing with human rights is profoundly necessary, extraordinarily important, but deeply insufficient. And that perhaps uniquely in this moment in human history, a different conception and approach to human rights is required. And I'm going to try and sketch that out to you, what that approach might look like. And it's something that you can go into an enormous amount of eye-watering detail in. So I'm going to sketch out the broad contours of what that approach looks like, and then hope that through both a dialogue with you after my talk, but also hopefully over time, the details on what this approach will be filled out by people who are carrying the torch of human rights going forward. So I'm going to try to do something relatively ambitious, which is sort of argue for a reconceived notion of human rights. So here goes. So the modern human rights movement emerged as a response to the atrocities of war and the violations of international humanitarian law. It grew in urgency following the horrors of the Holocaust and the systemic violations of human rights enabled by the geopolitics of the Cold War. It drew inspiration from the struggle against apartheid and the battle for civil rights in the United States. And for a brief period in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, we negotiated an end to apartheid, and we witnessed the birth of the International Criminal Court. We thought that a global consensus had emerged, that constitutional democracies predicated on the rule of law, separation of powers, free elections, and market economies were the best guarantors of human rights. And throughout this period, human rights lawyers in their struggle against undemocratic and authoritarian rule adopted 2 broad goals. We wanted deep democracy comprising free elections, free media, real voting rights, and ideally a rich and participatory approach to government, not just the formal right to participate in occasional elections. And we wanted constitutionalism, effective institutions buttressed by the separation of power and justiciable bills of rights. I had the great privilege of serving as the Executive Secretary of South Africa's Truth Commission, and in that capacity and thereafter, helped to build the field of transitional justice as a response to mass atrocity, conflicts, and authoritarian rule. We proposed and adopted a range of approaches: trials, truth commissions, reparations, institutional reform, and efforts to promote reconciliation in deeply divided societies. It's fair to say, both in South Africa and each of the 30 countries I've worked in since, that we would regard our work done and victory achieved if we established democracy and constitutionalism. We all agreed that in deeply divided and unequal societies, that huge disparities in wealth and opportunity, you would need to take steps to address these root causes of conflict. But when pressed to articulate how actually to do this, we would argue that this is the work of economists or development officials. We could afford to be ignorant or agnostic about the best way to do this for 2 reasons. First, we believe that establishing democracy and constitutionalism provides the best procedural setting to create equity and economic inclusiveness. The work of human rights lawyers is to create a level playing field of ideas in which the best economic concepts compete. We also argued that our field lacked the requisite expertise to think about distributional justice. And while some of us feared or suspected that greater substantive equality did not automatically flow from democracy and constitutionalism, we believed that other fields and disciplines were better equipped to make the contribution. As a result, human rights lawyers, including myself, have adopted, some would say largely by default, a passive and procedural approach to substantive equality. There's a certain irony in this because human rights lawyers tend to genuinely care about equity and fairness in the economy. This approach has arguably been tolerable in the 50 years since Nuremberg, but I would argue that in the past 20 years, a set of megatrends have begun to converge, which means that both the practice and conception of human rights has to fundamentally change. These megatrends, which are both mutually reinforcing and powerfully destructive, will be deeply familiar to all of you. So I will set them out in summary form. The first is climate. It's now almost certain that we will overshoot the Paris goal of keeping the global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees centigrade. It's now foreseeable and increasingly certain that the following will occur: extreme weather, mostly heat, but also cold, the return of tropical disease, water and wind-related natural disasters, particularly coastal flooding and powerfully destructive hurricanes, declining agricultural yields, vanishing fish stocks, droughts and desertification. These facts will result in hundreds of thousands and then potentially millions of excess deaths. This will shake the foundations of how and where we live, what we produce and what we eat. Simply put, it's likely to change everything about human existence and how we relate to one another. The second trend, population. On current trends, the human population will be almost 10 billion people shortly after 2050. That's a 30% increase in roughly 30 years. We will need to produce 70% more food in a context where current food production is environmentally unsustainable. In the next 30 years, we will need to build and expand new cities to accommodate the entire population of India and China combined in an already congested world. Unless we radically change course, population growth will predictably lead to deforestation, the massive increase in the consumption of high carbon footprint protein, the wholesale destruction of marine ecosystems, intensive fish farming, and a wholly unsustainable investment in the built environment. In the already existential fight against climate change, population growth compounds the challenge in frightening ways. The third megatrend, growing inequality. We live in a world in which the 26 richest people have as much wealth as the 3.8 billion people who comprise the bottom half of the world's population. 82% of wealth generated in 2017 went to the top 1%. There are many complex and interrelated reasons for this. First, the changing nature of capital formation. Great wealth is increasingly produced and concentrated in companies that rely on intellectual property, principally technology, and not labor. These companies tend to have fewer employees, and crucially, fewer owners. Tax systems are deeply flawed and not fit for purpose. We tend to tax work and not wealth. Our tax systems have not kept up with all the jurisdictional and economic tricks that both corporations and individuals are able to deploy not to pay their fair share of taxes. And because elites are increasingly capturing politics, tax regimes are becoming more aggressive and less progressive when precisely the opposite is required. Electorally significant percentages of citizens in many countries have seen their standards of living stall or stagnate in the course of a generation, causing them to question not just the effectiveness of incumbent political leaders, but the legitimacy of the system as a whole. The fourth megatrend, the changing nature of work. We are witnessing unprecedented tech-driven disruption. By some estimates, 30% of all current jobs are at risk within the next 15 years. 44% of all jobs held by people with lower levels of education are at risk. The most benign outcome would be a radical disruption and reordering of work. In this scenario, there would be no net decline in aggregate employment, but likely an intergenerational lag as people with old skills struggle to adjust to new jobs. A less benign scenario would see structural joblessness. A growing segment of a rising population will not find work as automation and artificial intelligence permanently reshape labor markets. Consider just the following. 2 industrial behemoths, General Electric and Ford, combined have roughly the same revenue as Apple. But Apple employs roughly a quarter of their combined workforce. The predictable anger and anxiety caused by these disruptions in the job market will alter the perceived legitimacy of the systems that allowed this to happen. 5th, migration. 2018 will see the highest levels of human migration on record. The megatrends I've just described, climate, population growth, conflict, disparities in opportunity and income, have all played a major role. There are 244 million people who are migrating. That's 3.3% of the global population, not including 40 million internally displaced persons and 22 million refugees. For all the reasons I've listed above, we can be sure that in 10 years' time, these numbers will be significantly larger. What's more, because of mobility, acute conflict in a small number of places can cause massive jumps in refugees. 57% of all refugees in the world stem from just 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. The result, when 3%, and possibly in some scenarios as much as 10% of the global population is moving into societies that they are not originally from. In the context of global distress, the introduction and presence of the other can and has produced a virulent strain of identity politics. This will not improve unless we act. And finally, the 6th megatrend, the end of facts. Hyper-efficient search combined with widely adopted platforms and services, Google and Facebook in particular, has revolutionized the marketing and distribution of goods and services with huge social benefits. But there have been at least 2 profoundly negative consequences. We have fundamentally disrupted the advertising base that traditional news organizations have relied on and enabled the partisan fragmentation of news. The way we generate, distribute, and acquire civic information, those facts we need in order to make informed political decisions, is increasingly performed in politically homogeneous echo chambers which exclude alternative facts and opinion. Facts are the necessary predicate to create the political will to generate sensible solutions to these megatrends. Without facts, our politics is less susceptible to reason and accountability and more vulnerable to demagoguery and myth. Each of these megatrends on their own constitute a profound threat to equitable societies and a sustainable planet. But taken together, they have demonstrated that our procedural and passive approach to governance, that constitutionalism and democracy will create a permanent framework for protecting human rights and producing solutions to the concerns of our citizenry, is not fit for purpose. Climate change, plus population growth, plus inequality, plus joblessness, plus mass migration, plus fake news are profoundly disrupting political, social, and economic life, and have caused significant numbers of citizens to believe not that existing political parties don't have the answers, but that the current system is illegitimate, cannot produce the answers, and is perhaps responsible for the problems. And this is why the siren song of populist demagogues all across the political spectrum is so appealing, and why, when they capture power, they are able, often with considerable political support, to begin to dismantle the democratic and constitutional frameworks that put them into power. From the US to Brazil, from Poland to Hungary, from Venezuela to here in the United Kingdom, populism is profoundly disrupting constitutional frameworks and norms that we mistakenly thought provided a rational framework for governance. What is worse, when these populists capture power, their politics are generally counterproductive and do little to actually address the existential threats posed by the megatrends. Put simply, the systems we devised to prevent another Holocaust, to guard against the reemergence of another Latin American dictator, to bury apartheid, or to deepen democracy in states that emerged from the legacy of the Cold War, are no longer fit for purpose. What is required is a move away from a conception of human rights and governance that is passive and procedural to one that is more proactive and purposeful, and which seeks to actively confront each of these megatrends that are predictably influencing the future. This is more important than ever because arguably for the first time in history, time is our enemy. Martin Luther King's famous quote that the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends towards justice is perhaps the most inaccurate and unhelpful description of the struggle of our times. The megatrends perfectly invert this phrase. They are bending the arc of history towards injustice. Literally each day that passes makes the cost of dealing with climate greater. There's an utterly compelling case for there to be the biggest set of proactive investments in saving the planet and addressing inequality now and not a second later. I would therefore like to propose a retooling of Martin Luther King's quote. The path of the moral universe is short, and it leads towards a precipice. Doing nothing, or even acting slowly, will make justice impossible. So hopefully that's terrified you. It should. But I came of age in an era of Mandela and Tutu, and their approach to the great struggle of our time fashioned in me an unshakable optimism. Humans are capable of great evil, to be sure, but we're capable of greater good. What follows, therefore, is a necessarily incomplete account of a new approach to human rights. Because of the precision and detail required in confronting each global threat, and because of the time available, I will sketch out a few directions of travel rather than the full journey. But hopefully this proactive and purposeful approach will contain ideas that will be elaborated by others. First, I think we need to radically redefine our approach to citizenship. A narrow conception of citizenship grants a person an entitlement to vote and confers upon them the most robust and enforceable set of rights and benefits within a given jurisdiction. It's profoundly passive and procedural and requires very little in return other than perhaps the payment of taxes. We need to embrace a new notion of citizenship rooted in these three concepts. First, the notion of metaphysical guilt as articulated by Karl Jaspers. You should feel guilt and responsibility when you fail to act when another person's rights are being violated. Second, the African concept of Ubuntu. You are who you are through your connectedness to others. We derive our meaning by caring about the circumstances of our fellow citizens and by deepening bonds of solidarity between us. And third, responsibility to protect. This principle, enshrined in international law, obligates and authorizes a set of escalating and proactive steps to stop mass atrocity. Applied to citizenship, it would make us responsible for action when confronted by global threats. Because the payback for acting now is 100 times better than acting tomorrow, and because not acting places us in existential jeopardy, we must adopt a form of citizenship that reflexively gears us toward action. This action must seek to remedy the inequality and exclusion that threatens to divide us and to tear our societies apart, and urgently address the planetary challenges that imperil everyone. From the moment we're born to our last breath, we need to inculcate in ourselves and our fellow citizens the same level of urgency in combating these megatrends that human rights activists have deployed when confronting international crimes. And this is not just empty philosophy. The Danes didn't have a passive and procedural approach to morality. They acted because they felt Karl Jaspers's metaphysical guilt, and therefore per capita saved and protected more Jews from the horrors of the Third Reich than any other nation. We need a generation who feels the same way about coal-fired power plants and the protection and planting of trees. Movements to counter the megatrends require the same level of urgency and conviction as the Freedom Riders, the anti-apartheid movement, and the Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. How might a purposeful and proactive approach to human rights work in practice? Let's discuss efforts to address some of the megatrends. Climate. Any effort to reorder affairs at a global level requires both sticks and carrots. Let's start first with the carrots. The world needs a new Green Deal. Just as we have a Peace Corps, we also need a Planet Corps. A mobilized generation of investors and entrepreneurs, citizens and public officials who are financing the infrastructure and companies that arrest climate change and create greater equity. This movement has started, but it needs an unprecedented investment in people, research, and capital. The list of projects is as long as it is inspirational, and each has a vital role to play in reversing climate change. In cities across the world, smart homes and smart grids are deploying artificial intelligence to enhance the efficiency with which energy is generated, distributed, and consumed. Tens of thousands of off-grid entrepreneurs are using solar panels, batteries, and cell phones to leapfrog old forms of energy to sustainably power communities. Marine reserves are being established in depleted oceans and demonstrating the ability to replenish fish stocks with encouraging speed. Dozens of technologies are being deployed to clean highly polluted air. Material scientists are investing in efforts to recycle, repurpose, and eventually abolish plastics. A new generation of sustainable fabrics will soon replace leather and polyester, two of the main culprits contributing to fashion's destructive environmental impact. Botanists are working on a new breed of superplants who have the opportunity and potential to sequestrate carbon in their root systems. This is the start of a new liberation movement that we need to embrace, encourage, train, and finance. Now let's talk about sticks. First, the time has come to support punishment for climate change denial. While the analogy is imperfect and inadequate, we have criminalized Holocaust denial because disputing these irrefutable facts risks a recurrence of the horrors that pose a threat to all of us. Climate change is now as undeniable as the Holocaust, and the threat it poses to all of humanity is existential. Denial has been funded by narrow interests that almost always have a financial stake in planetary destruction. It has impeded and delayed action that is existentially necessary to protect the planet. This should no longer be permitted in a civilized society. Second, the time has come to criminalize climate harm. Certain forms of environmental damage, particularly those associated with irreversible damage to assets that are essential to meeting the Paris goals, should be criminalized. For example, we should start by designating indigenous forests in certain strategic geographies as world survival sites and criminalize the actions of those who would seek to finance or organize their destruction. Thirdly, unenforceability. In the same way we regard certain contracts as unenforceable because they violate public policy or use Kogan's norms, we should begin to regard certain contracts that predictably lead to climate damage, like, for example, the building of coal-fired power plants, as contrary to public interest. Hopefully, this uncertainty around enforceability will cloud the financing of these projects and orient capital to greater certainty and more sustainable goals. How might we approach joblessness? We now know that large categories of employment, drivers, retail workers, coal miners, even radiologists will drastically decline. The societal and human consequences will be grave. Invoking the notions of Ubuntu and metaphysical guilt, we have a responsibility to care for and feel solidarity towards fellow citizens who are experiencing this harm. Disruption is the price we pay for innovation, but we cannot welcome the benefits and avoid the costs imposed on others. The time has come to establish a norm and a corresponding obligation. When a technology which has significant social benefits threatens to trigger mass unemployment and other forms of societal disruption, then we need a systemic disruption response. The predictable impacts, both negative and positive, need to be documented, and a set of stakeholders must develop a proactive and purposeful strategy to seek to offset the harm. The state should finance part of this endeavor. We all benefit from innovation and should therefore be willing to bear part of its costs. But so too should the companies that have caused and benefited from this disruption. I would argue it's actually in their long-term interests to acknowledge and respond to the dislocation caused. And as we develop these strategies, we should seek to address as many of the megatrends as possible. We need what I've termed intersectional solutions. For example, a program to train coal miners and drivers to green retrofit buildings will help to address not only climate change, but also inequality and joblessness. Retail workers can be retrained into a new generation of teachers providing early childhood education. High street real estate, devastated by the Amazon phenomenon, can be repurposed into libraries, creches, and coding centers. Startup financing can be provided to companies that facilitate the training of people in vulnerable industries to acquire the skills required in new burgeoning industries. What might we do with the end of facts? Traditional media models have been profoundly disrupted. Old news organizations derived a significant percentage of their revenues from advertising. Companies such as Google and Facebook now facilitate search with far greater precision, and their combined annual revenue is consequently and astonishingly almost $200 billion. If we believe that independent, fact-based news organizations are essential to democratic life, then we need to fund and subsidize a smooth transition for existing news companies towards a new business model. The transition costs of acquiring new subscribers and seeking new forms of revenue should be partially funded by these highly profitable disruptors. We should also consider a media levy paid by some of these companies to underwrite public television and radio stations to ensure that citizens are responsibly educated and informed. We should also recognize the power of new media companies to target and convey information. Given their enormous impact, they should now be subject to some form of regulation in the way we regulate traditional broadcasters. Once you have systemic and societal impact, you bear a set of societal responsibilities, including a commitment to fair and balanced reporting, prudent fact-checking, and a consideration of societal harm. Instagram's recent commitment to remove images of self-harm is a belated recognition of power and responsibility. The principle has therefore been conceded. Let the responsible codification begin. Migration. In the past, we fought to protect refugees who have had a well-founded fear of persecution. A passive and procedural approach would regard the conferring of refugee status as a victory in itself. A purposeful and proactive approach sees the productive integration of refugees into our society as the true measure of success. We need to ensure that when refugees are granted leave to remain, that we welcome them and make them productive members of our society. We should replicate and adopt the model developed by RefuAid, a small and innovative social enterprise that provides low-interest loans to refugees with professional qualifications in their home countries to enable them to requalify and practice in the countries of their settlement. Too many doctors are driving Ubers because they don't have £10,000 to fund their requalification. A relatively small investment in a low-interest loan will unlock their full potential. There's nothing that counters prejudice and demagoguery more effectively than having refugees make a meaningful contribution to the communities in which they live. The only thing that stands in the way of these simple and effective measures is smart financing and a lack of imagination and empathy. In conclusion, never before in human history has the world been so pregnant with both peril and possibility. But I fundamentally believe that pessimists have it wrong. We possess all the skills and the resources required to confront and overcome the challenges we face. All that is needed is a new, clear-eyed approach to citizenship, infused with a healthy dose of both optimism and urgency. If we fail to act, we imperil everything that we love and value. But if we do, and we succeed, then our generation will have achieved the greatest turnaround in human history. It's a truly unique opportunity, and one that would be literally a challenge, a tragedy to squander. Thank you.